So yeah, they Answers in Genesis has this thing where they think guys like John Walton are super elitist, and of course, when you see the title of the article, they argue that Genesis 1 through 11 should be plain and simple, that everybody ought to be able to understand it, because why wouldn't God reveal it so everybody throughout all of history could understand it? The problem that I have with this, as wonderful as it sounds, is that Answers in Genesis is an apologetics organization. And every apologetics organization would agree that there are so many passages in the Bible where a plain and simple reading generates problems, where you actually need a lot of context to understand things. So, for example, for centuries and centuries, Christians have had issues with slavery in the Bible. The Bible never directly legally condemns slavery; it regulates it. We don't get we get like we never get super direct negations of slavery in the New Testament either. Um, you have or think about like the plain and simple reading of the text where the prophet Elijah summons bears to come maul some children. Like if you're just reading the plain and simple reading of that, that freaks a lot of people out. And I don't know. You could look at things like polygamy in the Old Testament. You could look at the Canaanite genocide, for example. That freaks a lot of people out. The plain and simple reading of the text. And if you go to Answers in Genesis's website, they have all these articles where they'll play super scholar elitists linguists to try to explain to you actually slavery. Your presuppositions about slavery as a modern person aren't correct, and they need to be calibrated to the ancient world. They'll argue that. They'll argue the same for all sorts of things like polygamy. They'll have articles that will explain that the story of Elijah summoning bears to, slaughter children. You need to understand there's some translation difficulties there that make the plain and simple reading a lot harsher than it would have been in its original context. So, as an apologetics organization, they concede that a plain and simple reading of the Bible, that helped cause the Civil War in America, over slavery. You can't always assume the plain and simple reading is the correct one.
Yeah. So basically, they're inconsistent.
Right, and this is so obvious. Like anyone who's read Genesis on their own, with genuine curiosity, it's full of so many very, very obviously mysterious uh, things within it. Like it just assumes that it's normal for a woman to be talking to a snake. The text assumes that you know what a cherub is. The text assumes that you understand this concept of a tree of knowledge and good and evil, which I've read hundreds of articles and commentaries on Genesis. I still don't think I understand what the knowledge of good and evil is exactly. uh,
Yeah.
everybody that reads Genesis and they don't have theological blinders on, it's pretty
Yeah.
obvious that it's such a mysterious and cool and sort of dreamlike text.
I remember specifically being like 18 years old and reading Genesis, and I was like, and I don't know, for some reason, I had read Genesis 1 before, but for some reason, it took like 2 or 3 times for me to realize the sun is created on day 4 and you have light on day 1. That's a
Yeah, and I mentioned that in my master's thesis.
yeah, that's a
I had to go to
question.
Egyptian texts and stuff to understand that.
Yeah,
And
that's a question that the text raises, and you might have to consult a scholar or at least your pastor at minimum. You might have to consult somebody and ask them, "I can't make sense of this. What's up with the text is doing something weird here?"
yeah, it sounds so nice theologically to say, well, God would have revealed it so even a little child could understand it in any culture that's ever existed, for the rest of eternity. But the reality is, when you just get down to the level of the text and you start reading it, there are very mysterious portions of it. We've already given a lot of examples. For example, you go to the Ugaritic text, you can look at how Yahweh has the titles of Baal. You could go to my master's thesis. You could see how King Hezekiah and ministers of the court of Uzziah, they all had seals that showed Yahweh as the sun god, depicted in the form of the Egyptian god Ra. We even have one seal that I've argued it takes iconography of the god Horus and it applies it to Yahweh, which is again Mortensen's theology would never predict that Hezekiah should have been allowed on his official royal seal of his administration to depict Yahweh in the form of the Egyptian god Ra. He would find that blasphemous, but yet it's there in the archaeology. And we have to be able to explain that within a way that comports with biblical theology and the Bible's claims about Hezekiah not being a polytheist. So if you want to interpret your Bible correctly, you have to be willing to go to these pagan texts because the authors of the Bible themselves are constantly referencing these pagan texts. They're constantly pulling on similar ideas within the mythology. They'll even pull from languages like Akkadian in order to neologize new words within their own language. It's kind of like if you were to read John Milton's Paradise Lost, you're going to want to do some research into Greek myth because he references it almost every other page, and there's nothing wrong with that. It doesn't make his work less Christian or less holy because he's familiar with the surrounding culture that he's writing in. It's just ridiculous. Again, if your theology prevents you from going to these pagan texts with the biblical authors, then your theology is trying to be better than the Bible. It's trying to be more holy than the biblical authors, which is just ridiculous.